Good afternoon, everybody. Again, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for subscribing, for liking, and sharing Friday Drinks. We come back to you today with a very special edition. I know it's always special, but this is extra special because this is actually a rabbit hole, and we haven't done a rabbit hole in quite a while. So I'm quite excited about this because it's with Rufaro, our resident technology of Shiando, right? And this will be a rabbit hole on all things technology, but we want to focus on Africa. But before we do that, it's just you and I on set.
Yeah, but the producer is around. He just declined to join us for this particular episode, so we have to behave. And speaking of behaving, why are you cutting off blood circulation to that organ that matters so much, your brain? What is this thing that you're wearing around your neck?
Well, this is actually it's called a cravat or a scarf for you, and I think it's just fashionable. It's just a way of introducing November, and I love November, and I love what it brings, the rains, but also the ability for us to accessorize, and this is how I accessorize.
Yeah, but it's very hot. You're wearing a thick shirt with long sleeves, and then
No, it's actually cotton and it breathes.
Okay. All right.
Just so you know.
Well, we'll have to take it from you. You're the resident fashionista.
Well, you don't think I look dashing?
No, dashing is not the word that I would use. And are you going to tell us, is this $1 per item? Did you get this from a bureau or from something? From somewhere more interesting?
No. This is far a lot more interesting than that. This is Thomas Pink. Quite like Thomas Pink.
Okay. Yeah. They make great
British.
shirts.
Yeah, they make great shirts.
Yeah.
And they last. I mean, I've had this shirt for quite some time, and it's my go-to summer shirt.
Okay. Fantastic.
Yeah. But tell us, what are you drinking? I mean, I'm having an Earl Grey because I feel particularly European.
So you're wearing a long sleeve shirt, a cravat, that is, right?
Yeah.
And you're having, on this hot summer day, you're having tea.
Biology is on my side.
Okay.
So,
all right.
Yeah. It has a cooling effect.
Okay. All right.
But I did particularly feel like having tea. I haven't had tea in a while. And I just thought, my go-to Earl Grey with loose tea leaves, which just makes it even more interesting.
Yeah.
But what do you have?
Yeah, so I'm having something that I haven't tried at all. It's from the house of Bruichladdich. We've had quite a lot of Bruichladdich on this show. This one is not peated, so it doesn't have that strong smoky smell. And they call it the Bear Barley 2009. I think they're using a different kind of barley that's not common, and it was distilled in 2009. So I'm going to try it out, and I'll share with the audience.
What's the interesting tidbit about it?
So they're using so this particular single malt is the malt is actually from this barley called Bear barley. It's not your regular barley. It yields much less than regular barley, but it has a much higher starch content. And the distillery, every distillery is all about marketing its brand and telling us why their particular whiskey is special. So that's the story that they're going with. That look, this is an unusual barley that has lower yield and higher starch content, and it's gonna impart on the beverage. But I'm a bit I'm not moved by the glowing characterization of whiskeys by their distillers. I like to form my own opinion. But generally, I've been pleasantly surprised by this distillery. So hopefully they don't disappoint.
Well, we'll find out.
Yeah, sure.
It's a rabbit hole, so
yeah, I love that we're talking about technology. I'm very passionate about technology.
And the reason, the background to this is, of all my friends, you're the one who, well, at least thinks seriously about technology and how technology actually affects the world. And I think that's also how you live your life. You're the first person to have the 15 Pro Max. Yeah.
Well, not the first person.
Well, amongst us, you went gung-ho on it. I'm just still waiting for the price to come off. but you were quite keen on it. Not that you use a lot of it. I mean, we have to teach you how to take photos on it.
I'm not as passionate about photography as you are. So I let they call it computational software. So all of the things that you passionate photographers learn about lighting and the position of how to focus and all of that, the software does for us novices, and it's actually quite remarkable to what extent some of them take this. So, for example, in the Android universe, if you focus on the moon at night and you take a photo, you will get this remarkably clear and impressive photo of the moon. But if you do that on an iPhone, no matter which iPhone, you'll get this horrible fuzzy picture. And it turns out what the Android software does is it figures out where in the world you are and what the lighting conditions are and what side of, what the image of the moon looks like. And they have this stock of high resolution images of the moon.
But how does that work if you're not online? So suppose I do take a photo with my Android, but I'm actually not online. I don't have data, or I'm not on Wi-Fi.
Yeah. So I suspect some of the images are preloaded onto your phone. I don't know whether it works if you're offline, but you get these remarkably clear pictures that are impressive. But it's actually just computational software. So sometimes when you take a photo, if you've got a really good smartphone, if your hand is shaking or the subject is moving, the software actually figures out that your hand is shaking or the subject is moving, and it makes all kinds of adjustments to the image so that it actually looks like you took your hand wasn't shaking or the subject wasn't moving. So the computational software is actually playing a bigger and bigger role in photography, to the extent that the Apple crowd was so confident. They had a presentation last week for their new laptops, and they reported at the end of their presentation that all the whole thing was done with iPhone Pro Maxes.
Yeah, I'll tell you what my interest with phones is. Usually the aesthetics and the photography. That's really my interest in phones. But your interest is more scientific than mine.
Well, look, I'm just a techie. I just love gadgets.
What has changed when we look at the phone and what we're able to do? So when I look at photography, there's just a whole lot more. I mean, I don't need to move around with my SLRs, and I used to move around with 3 or 4 SLRs, and, it was just bulky and, not necessarily convenient. Whereas now I just move around with my phone, and there's a whole lot that I can do. And I can upload a lot of programs on the phone, and I take, they're not exactly SLR quality, but, they can withhold their own, and they're brilliant. They're photos that I can look at, and I can, archive for. Usually, that's what I do because it's storytelling, and I can have them for a very long time. And they just
you're quite active on Instagram, and you post quite a lot of what you take.
Not on Instagram, actually. I'm not that active on Instagram. I'm quite active on Twitter. For a reason.
X,
on X now.
Okay.
See, there we go. I still get confused. But maybe you can start there. Like,
sure.
The interest in technology. Why? Why the interest in technology?
I don't know. I can't really claim to have, a logical or well-reasoned argument. I've always been fascinated by technology. I've always been, but I think there is something magical about technology. Arthur C. Clarke actually captured it quite succinctly when he said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So there's this quality about technology that's just cool, that just captures the imagination. So if you think about how children are fascinated by magicians, I think technology is the adult version of magic.
So, Peter Thiel makes an argument, or which argument I actually buy into, but I'm quite keen on.
Yes, I'm very familiar with Thiel's thinking on the subject.
Yeah. So if you think about technology, and you're quite right, we can euphemistically look at it as magic, but technology was well, cut across all sectors, all different sectors. Whereas what has happened now, it's information technology that has moved the furthest. Whereas technology, when you look at airlines, for example, the technology hasn't improved that much since the 60s.
Yeah.
If you look at bread, for example, manufacturing bread, that technology hasn't moved in a very long time. If you look at toilets, they call it lavatories. That also hasn't changed in centuries, maybe 200 years. If you look at bathrooms, for example, even the shape of bathrooms, and that hasn't changed maybe for 400 years. So if we narrowly define technology in information technology, then it's right that the world has moved. But if you were to increase, or if you were to look at technology from all aspects of our lives, that magic is just not there. When I get to the airport, it's exactly what an airport looked like, 100 years ago. An aeroplane is exactly how it looked 60, 70 years ago. What are your thoughts and views on that?
Yeah, so I'm very familiar with Peter Thiel's thinking on this. I think he the quote that comes to mind is he says, "We were promised flying cars and we got 140 characters," and he's disappointed because the Boeing 747 was invented in the 60s, and the fastest commercial jet airliners aren't flying faster than the Boeing 747. In fact, we had the Concorde for a few years, and then that was discontinued. So we don't even have supersonic commercial flight anymore. So I think I understand the argument and where it's coming from. I just think that it's not true. I think he's wrong on this. So some sectors and industries haven't moved as quickly as others, and it's not because human beings are less innovative. I think a big part of it is just the framework. So, for example, if you're in the business of building commercial airliners, the regulatory framework is very strict. There's this. I think we take the idea of we're paranoid about planes falling out of the sky, and so it's much harder to innovate in the space of commercial aviation than it is with smartphone apps, because if an app doesn't work, worst case scenario, it corrupts your phone and your phone crashes. But if a commercial plane malfunctions at 30,000 feet, it falls out of the sky and kills people. So it's much harder to, I think the expression was coined by Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, talking about innovation in Silicon Valley. He says, move quickly and break things, right? And the idea is you try something, it doesn't work, and that's okay. You learn from that, and then you try something else. And so there's just some sectors due to the regulatory framework. So whether it's medicine, commercial aviation, you just can't move as quickly because at every step in the game, there's a regulator saying, well, is this safe? Is this okay? Have you checked that box? So the reason why most of the progress, or the quickest progress is in software and computers, is because the safety is not such a big concern. So people can move quickly and break things.
So are you saying that government is the inhibitor to technology actually getting the magic that it's supposed to have?
Yeah, so there's this, so you're an economist, and so you've probably come across that graph where you look at 60, 50 years ago, and you look at different sectors, right? So high school education over the last 50, 60 years in the developed world, the cost has gone up, right? If you look at the cost of constructing certain types of infrastructure, right? As the regulatory, as the governments have piled on more and more regulations, the cost over time has gone up. But
drugs,
healthcare, but things that are not as regulated, like the cost of data or the cost of compute or the cost of telecoms, the prices actually come off materially over the last 50, 60 years. So I think that's a big part of the equation, which is regulation. And I would make the case that if there was less regulation or smarter regulation, in some of these spaces, you'd see much, much more innovation. So, for example, we had COVID 2 years ago, and then we had these new mRNA vaccines. But that technology, in terms of knowing that you can make an mRNA vaccine, it's been there for decades. But it was constrained by stringent regulation. And because of the crisis, the COVID crisis, a lot of those regulations were relaxed.
So then why are you so confident about the future? Because obviously governments are just going to get bigger and bigger. And that's what we see. If you look at over the 100 years, and I tend to agree and buy into your argument that a lot has to do with regulation. But if you look at 100 years, as governments get bigger and bigger and bigger, there's more and more regulation. So why do you think that technology, there's still a bright future as far as technology is concerned? Because regulation is just going to get more complex and governments are just going to get more bureaucratic and bigger.
Well, I'm not sold that governments are necessarily going to get bigger and more bureaucratic.
That's the trend that we've seen.
So we've seen that trend. And I think, but I also see pushback. So, if you look at the 2016 election in the US, for example, you had a complete outsider, Trump, who won that election. And part of the things on his platform was draining the swamp, removing all these regulations and red tape, making the government smaller. So we can argue that we didn't really shrink the size of government, but that certainly was a big part of his platform. So it resonates with people. And if you look at the current cycle, there are people who are talking about cutting the size of government, cutting red tape, removing. So I will agree with you that over the last 100 years, governments have tended to get bigger and more bureaucratic. But I think the jury is still out on whether that trend is going to continue, or whether in the democratic world, at least, we might see significant pushback and people say, no, actually, the government is.
So another thought, another Peter Thiel thought is around innovation. So there's the 0 to 1, and then there's N+1. And he argues that, the developed world is concerned with the 0 to 1 because they have the budget and they have the scientists, they have, the ecosystems to drive that innovation. So these are things that are out of this world, haven't been tried and tested, and they've got the capital to do so. So that's why you have Silicon Valley and the ecosystem there. And he says that the developing world should focus on, taking and adopting that technology and not necessarily coming up with their own technology, because they just don't have the budgets. And he reckons that's how China has grown, because China, or even India for that, as an example, have not necessarily been coming up with new innovations, but they just take whatever is there and they just scale it. Now, the question I have for you, because I buy into that theory that actually we just don't have the budgets. We don't have the technical expertise.
We don't have the capacity to compete.
We don't even have the capacity to compete. But the question I have for you is, why is it China and India have been able to scale, adopt, primarily in healthcare? If you look at India, they take the drugs and they scale them, and they've got the markets. But in Africa, that hasn't happened. Why? What's stopping Africa from just adopting technology? There's no need to reinvent the wheel, as the saying goes. And we just need to replicate and scale. But it seems like, or it looks like, there's a hindrance of sort. Why hasn't that happened?
So Africa's biggest problem, if I had to distill it to one word, and this covers everything, not just technology, it's leadership, right? We just don't have the leadership. And I'll push back a little bit on this idea that Africa should just focus on being a good copycat and adopting technology developed elsewhere. Like if you look at the world's innovation hubs, right? So you've got Silicon Valley on the west coast of the US. You've got London is also considered a big hub. But you know what other part of the world is considered a big tech hub? Tel Aviv. And that's in Israel. Israel's got a population of less than 10 million. But it's, it's produced, it's punched well above its weight in terms of producing startups that become billion-dollar businesses. And, they've contributed a lot in the space of innovation.
But Israel is considered the developed world.
Yeah, but it is a developed country. but it's a small country. So the argument that you have to be big and
That's
do
not the
things at
argument.
scale.
The argument is if you're in the developed world, then you deal with the 0 to 1. But if the rest of the world, why, for example, so if you look at any technological advancement, just the research and development and so on, it's a huge budget. Some of it, it's more than the Zimbabwean budget, if you think about it. So why should the Zimbabwean government really be thinking about, sending satellites to the galaxy because there's something that we want to earn on it, or we just piggyback on
Yeah.
people already doing it, and we just focus on replication and primarily healthcare, because that's a big industry if you think about it. Yeah, why am I buying Panadol pills in Zimbabwe, in Africa, when we could just rejig the technology and have something that is accessible by the entire populations.
Yeah, so for sure, there's no point in reinventing the wheel. And to the extent that something's mature and it's been demonstrated to work and we can adapt it to our circumstances, we should absolutely do that. But if you look at a place like Nairobi or Kenya, so it's considered one of Africa's innovation hubs, M-Pesa and mobile money. Basically, a lot of the innovation
that's unique to Africa
in that space.
It's a good point.
So I think one of the mistakes that we make as Africans is that in our path to development, a lot of the thinking is that we need to retrace the steps that the developed world took. So they went through the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, and then and they built a whole bunch of a certain type of industry and infrastructure, and then they developed to the next stage and the next stage.
So you believe we can leapfrog
and I think
stages?
So we need to study their history and development, and then we need to actually apply our minds to what works best for us. So certainly some things it might make sense to follow their footsteps, but certainly other things it doesn't. For example, telecoms. There's no need for us to build landline infrastructure in the 21st century when you can have cell phones, smartphones, and data, and the latest technology. So we really need to So if you think about energy, for example, in Zim, that's a topical issue because we have all these horrible power cuts. You have people talking about thermal coal in Zimbabwe, and yet today the cheapest per kilowatt hour form of electricity is solar. But you don't hear that conversation about building out massive solar farms and having grid level battery storage. We're still thinking in terms of the old framework because certainly 10 years ago, economically, solar and battery storage were not viable. They did not make sense. It would have been foolish for us as a country to invest in grid level solar or battery storage. But today it makes sense, right? Because the world has changed and the technology is now much, much cheaper. So I think we actually have to look at the developed world and also study our own circumstances and figure out what.
Well, I think what is true are the principles. So I'm happy that you bring in something like solar to the discussion, because that's very important, and it does make a good point for what you're saying. So what you're saying is access to electricity, which is very pivotal to any economic development. 20 or 50, or let's call it 100 years ago, would have relied on a national grid. Whereas today, it doesn't need to rely on a national grid.
Absolutely.
It can be individualized, but still it's the network effect. So the idea of economic development centers around networks, right? That the disaggregated the networks are, the more undeveloped you are. The more aggregated and closely linked are the networks, the better it is. So when we say networks, we mean the link between one individual to the next, right? So if you look at Africa, the part of the reason why we are undeveloped is because we're actually not linked. So if you look at rail, road, it's just very difficult to link our networks, because then we can't link our markets, we can't link the supply to those markets, and we can't. But rejigging, I get your point, is, well, it's not necessary for us to build a national grid, right? we could use the technology that's already there and ensure that the individuals, household, at household level, have access to electricity. If they have access to electricity, then the network becomes even more aggregated because they have link to the rest of the world.
Yep.
And that way we can. So I don't think it's necessary that we leapfrog, but I think that we can advance quicker.
Yeah, or we can have a hybrid. We don't have to go through the exact same path that the developed world went through. We can invent our own path that takes the best of what's worked in the developed world and then looks at our actual circumstances and adapts it. So maybe we need 50-50 national grid and distributed solar. I'm not prescribing a particular solution, but I'm saying that we have the benefit of not being developed and cherry picking and designing something that works best for us. But we don't seem to be given to doing that. I think we...
So it comes back to your issue of leadership. And I want you to just flesh that out, because that's a big issue.
Yeah, it's a big...
What do you mean by leadership? That Africa's failure is due to leadership?
So if you just think about it at a continent level, right? You've got, our borders were drawn in 1884 in Berlin. You've got 50 plus sovereign states with 50 governments with, 40 plus different currencies. I don't know how many different border posts and duty regimes there are. So that in itself is just, we're basically constraining our capacity to move across the continent, goods and services, to do national business. And that's a leadership issue. We've got an organization called the African Union. It should have moved the needle in this regard. It hasn't. So we just, so that's more political.
So could I push back a bit?
Yeah.
And I like the idea that you bring in 1884. There's this argument that if you look at our civilization, while it is true that we've got the oldest civilization, historically.
Africa is the cradle of mankind.
Cradle, right? But if you look at modern civilization, if you look at what has happened since the Industrial Revolution, if you look at what has happened to the modern state, we are still nascent. We're still at the early stages of the modern state. So there's an argument, and there are theorists who really push this argument, and I want to hear what you think, that actually what's happening in Africa is no different to what happened to the developed world. These are just the steps that we take to become a modern state. And it's not necessarily true that it's a leadership problem, but it's a confluence of problems. Leadership could be one, because we could make it quicker. If you look at South Korea
or Singapore,
any of these. But if you really think about it, they are very unique. What's more true is that countries just find it very difficult because you need to have a lot of these, confluence of a lot of influences. So, for example, you need to have markets that are developed. So you need to have a theory around, or a philosophy around how markets should develop, and practice, because people need to benefit. It's one thing to talk about markets, but if people have not seen markets working, it's always going to be very difficult for them to be to buy in totally. So markets have to work. Education, for example, it's not an overnight thing. You cannot expect a modern state to run when 90% of your people are uneducated or very low literacy rates. There are studies that have been done on fertility, for example. What sort of fertility levels you need to have for you to actually economically develop. So, and cultural factors as well. Because when you're moving from the bush to a modern state, that in itself should take maybe 3 or 4 generations just by itself. So while leadership is one, there are all these other factors that affect us. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I actually think that what you're saying reinforces my point about leadership. Because the harder it is to make the transition, the more critical it is to have great leadership, right? Because you've got all these challenges and constraints, And so the quality of your leadership matters much more. So if you actually look at a place that's doing well, like Scandinavia, right? If they have a horrible leader for the next 5-10 years, they'll do just fine because they've got institutions that work, the trains run on time. So there's very limited damage actually that a lousy leader can do in a place like Denmark or Sweden or Norway. But because we're undeveloped, because we have all these problems, we actually need to have exceptionally great leadership. If we are going to leapfrog and be another Singapore, where in 30 years we move from third world to first world. So leadership is actually even more essential in a place that's dysfunctional and undeveloped like Africa.
Okay, I have to admit that that's a very strong argument. So with that leadership, so we get the ingredients. So we're trying to bake this cake of a modern state.
Yeah.
Right. Leadership being one. What other things? So technology. So because we are talking about technology.
For sure.
So the leader then accepts that, okay, we need to be motivated and driven by technology, and we need to just take whatever technology that we have.
We need to be very aggressive on technology. And I think from an African standpoint, I think integration is very important because, if you think about the reason why the EU was formed, it's not because these sovereigns were poor or struggling. France, Germany, Britain, those are some of the biggest, most successful economies in the world. But they still felt that to be competitive on the global stage, they needed to integrate and have one big market and have one currency. So we actually aren't wealthy like the European countries were when they set up the EU. We actually have all these challenges. And I think one of the low-hanging fruits in terms of just cutting the cost of doing business across the continent is integration. Why do we have all these borders? Why do we have all these different currencies? Why do we have all these different tax regimes?
Do you see technology being the platform that can actually leapfrog, this conversation where, initially these are the conversations that you would have in Addis Ababa, but now it's disaggregated. The conversation is disaggregated. We're here in Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Harare, and we're discussing this. Someone in Lagos is discussing this. So is there a possibility that we could leapfrog where it's not a political issue, but it becomes a commercial issue where we just raise the bar and we have platforms in which we can have this conversation and we can have an African currency, for example, that it's very possible that it doesn't require a government for us to have an African currency?
I think...
because then the borders don't matter.
Yeah, but I think the borders do actually constrain us. So if you look at banking and finance, for example, every country in Africa has got a regulatory regime around what currencies you can use, what circumstances you can change from one currency to another, the requirements for to be a bank, to lend, to do all of these things. It's easy in the context of 2023 to imagine a digital wallet that is Pan-African, so you simply...
So why hasn't it happened?
Right.
Because, the Pan-Africanists seem to be in the corridors of politics, but in the corridors of commerce, where it should make sense that you should be Pan-African and you don't need governments. You could have a Bitcoin that's Africa, a digital wallet that's Africa-centered, that's Pan-African. You could have peer-to-peer lending that's Pan-African. You don't need governments for that to happen. Why hasn't it happened?
I actually think you do need government. So if you think about, for example, in the telecom space, you've got a network like MTN that's Pan-African. And so if you've got an MTN line in South Africa, and you travel to any country in Africa with MTN, you don't have to change your SIM card. You don't have to do anything. Your line just works. But they're licensed individually in each of those jurisdictions. And I suspect the reason why the MTN line just won't work here in Zim on the back of the other networks is because of their regulatory, their regulatory challenges, right? So I think that, the same timidity that we see in Zimbabwe, in our business community, in terms of just speaking out and calling out things that don't work, I think it's even more pronounced. I think it's pervasive across Africa. So, to the extent that businesses should actually be calling out leaders.
But with an e-wallet, there are lots of platforms that are global. So if you look at Facebook, it's a global platform.
Yep.
If you look at X, it's a global platform. But X is thinking around wallets, calling, all these things.
Yep.
And these are things that are going to disrupt Africa. And the
so I'll give you a classic example.
WeChat. Well, let me land, because I'm not going to allow you to get away with this. All right. These are global channels in which we have elevated. The conversation is not at government level, but it's at a global. Yeah. So if you look at cryptocurrency, it's at a global, and it's got nothing to do with governments. And I'm asking that, why can't we have a platform like Facebook, like X, that is Pan-African, African-centric, and the platform does not rely on governments, like MTN. So, kudos to MTN that they've managed to convince however many governments that they're the best person to lay, a mobile network.
Yep.
Yeah, that was true 20 years ago. Facebook doesn't have to have those challenges.
Yeah, but if, so I like that you mentioned Facebook. So if you look at, Facebook has a digital wallet as Facebook. They also have a wallet in WhatsApp in some jurisdictions. So, but why don't they have one here, right? If you look at WeChat, it's got a fantastic digital wallet that works in China. But in China, there is no WhatsApp because the Chinese won't license it. So ultimately, even if you're a Facebook and you can snap your finger and create a Pan-African digital wallet, right? You can't actually run it if the governments have a problem with it, because they're going to call Washington and say, look, what is your company doing?
Well, I'm just saying maybe not Facebook,
Yeah.
because I think now Facebook is too big and too political to make it happen. But I think I'm trusting that Elon, and we'll get into Elon, I think that Elon will not necessarily be stopped by the politics. I think that his platform is going to be
So again,
revolutionary.
I like that.
But why can't we have African entrepreneurs who are thinking more? So what I'm trying to do is to rejig that we don't think more. And these are your words, right? First break the system and then, make the laws after you've broken the system. Why can't, as entrepreneurs, why can't we have platforms that are Pan-African, that are looking at Pan-Africanism, and these platforms are for Africa? Then, yes, we then look at the regulation and the regulatory environment. But I don't want us to start with what is and isn't allowed by governments. But first, the thinking itself. Why can't we use the technology that's there to have Pan-African platforms?
Yeah, so the technology is there and it works. We can have a Pan-African digital wallet. We can have a Pan-African telecoms network and companies selling data across the continent. The problem is that the sovereigns don't like that idea. They will,
Has anyone tried?
Think about a classic example of something that's could easily be Pan-African, right? Starlink, satellite-based data, right? It works, right? If the government of Zimbabwe signed off, tomorrow you could import the Starlink receiver and you could have satellite-based internet at a price that's better than anything that's available here, right? So why isn't it here? The technology is there and it works, but why can't you do it? Because the government is saying, no, wait a minute, you need to go through us. You need our approval.
But that's also not true. I mean, if you look at Starlink, they're not in, I think they're in probably maybe 25% of African countries.
Yes, the South Africans have said, if you want Starlink to work here, you need to find a BEE partner. It can't be a wholly foreign-owned enterprise. right? But they're there. They're active in Mozambique. They're active in Zambia. They're active in, So, but they have to have a conversation. Can you imagine, like, if you're sitting at a desk in somewhere in California and you're managing the Starlink product, and you have to go through regulatory hoops in 50 plus African countries for you to sell your product. But the citizens of all these countries are saying, guys, please come. We want to buy your product. But you can't just roll out. You have to figure out, okay, in this country, who's the regulator? How do I engage them? And the regulator then says, oh yeah.
So are you arguing that perhaps maybe what we need to do is to standardize our laws, our regulation?
We need to integrate, and we need to, we've got we are not open for business. We're not business friendly. I think a charitable way to characterize a lot of the leadership in the state capitals across the continent is they're provincial, right? Everybody's looking at their little fiefdom, and they're inward looking, and they're protectionist, and this idea that they might be part of something bigger frightens them because it dilutes their power. Because imagine if you had a Pan-African digital wallet, let's say you had 10 of them that dominated banking and finance across the continent, and you had a Pan-African regulator, based in, I don't know,
wherever, doesn't matter.
Okay, so if that Pan-African regulator is not based in Harare, what do the guys who regulate banks in Harare then do? So
it's turf wars.
So if somebody tables this idea, says, look, guys, we will have.
We just need one regulator.
We just need one regulator, and we'll have these massive, Pan-African digital banking groups, and we'll be able to access more capital, and the cost of moving money around will be lower, and the average African will be so much better off, right? But you will be out of a job. How many people are actually going to sign off on that? Yeah, this is for the greater good, but I'm going to be unemployed. I'm going to be less powerful. I'm going to be less relevant. And I think that's where the inertia comes from this, the problem, the reason why, because I think anybody who thinks about it, it's obvious that Africa would be better off.
So it's also true of data centers, right? That now you need to build data centers in each country, whereas you could have just one data center that's, Pan-African.
Absolutely. Why do you need a data center in every jurisdiction? It's madness. It's, the costs just don't make sense. But yeah, so
and then you're competing with China, where it's just one regulator.
Absolutely.
India, one regulator. Okay, I think you've made your point there. So there's something that I want you to talk to in terms of technology and in terms of industries. There's this cursory thing that I did, which is I looked at the Forbes top 100 richest people in China and in India. And then I sort of looked at the particular sectors that they're in. And I found it very fascinating and interesting. And I want to hear your thoughts on this. Because if we were to do the opposite in America, we would find that the top 100 would be dominated by
technologists,
people in technology, which is not so true in China and in India. The dominant industry or the dominant sector actually is healthcare. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Manufacturing, right? Mm-hmm. Diversified industries, especially in India. Mm-hmm. And what I found interesting is technology is not anywhere near, right? Why is it that in the emerging markets, the countries that have developed, that you're not finding the billionaires in technology? One would have thought that in India, for example, but healthcare seems to be very dominant. Manufacturing, I can understand.
Yep.
But healthcare is very dominant. Why is that?
Yeah, so I think it's, again, it's amazing how powerful regulation can be as a force for good or as a force for bad. If you look at China, for example, you had these phenomenal entrepreneurs like Jack Ma in the technology space, right? Alibaba is basically an Amazon copycat. But I mean, he built a phenomenal business. Alipay is, an incredible digital wallet platform. But he was critical of the government, which is not always a bad idea, in an autocracy. And, so I think, again, what's actually amazing about Silicon Valley is not that there's something in the water or in the air. It's the culture, right? If you actually look at the individuals in Silicon Valley who've moved the needle, for the most part, they're not Americans. These
Chinese and Indians.
These are people from all over the world who've decided that that's the way they need to go to unlock their potential. And I think that's,
So you're saying your argument is these are people that soon enough, like Elon, realize that the countries that they were born in, they are these massive hurdles for them to jump,
flourish, yeah.
And they're better off being in a culture where they can flourish, and not necessarily because of capital. Because the billionaires, when you look at healthcare, when you look at manufacturing, there are billionaires being made. And yet in technology, is it because emerging market governments are suspicious of technology? Because they are allowing healthcare entrepreneurs to flourish. And yet technology entrepreneurs are finding it very difficult, or they're just not there, which I found very interesting. So I thought maybe it's just purely because of the natural progression of civilization or becoming a modern state, that it's first your basic, your ordinary sectors, things like manufacturing, things like healthcare, things like construction, things like being diversified, because the risk is actually way higher than it should be. So you're better off being diversified. And yet technology is not taking center stage like America is. So what you're arguing is actually it's because of regulation. Why emerging markets governments suspicious of technology?
I don't think they're suspicious of technology. I think they don't understand it. I also don't think they understand free market capitalism. They don't understand what drives capital formation. So I think it's a philosophical issue. I think
but the Chinese government, I want to push back. The Chinese government is one of the most very, very aggressive, one would argue, as far as AI is concerned. So artificial intelligence, I think they've done quite a lot of work there. Cryptocurrency, accepting crypto or some level of cryptocurrency, they've accepted it more than other governments. So they seem to, or maybe they want to be in control.
They want to be in control, and I think
of the
that's
process.
The biggest handicap for innovation in China is, I think one of the universal traits amongst entrepreneurs, because if you think about it at its core, what is innovation? It's a guy who sits and asks the question, this is the way we've always been doing this. Why are we doing it the way we've always been doing it? Why can't we do it differently? Right? And there's a certain rebelliousness, a certain cheekiness about innovation, because you're basically poo-pooing the way things were done before and the people who invented the previous dispensation, and you're saying we need to actually throw that out because there's this new, better way of doing it, right? And that kind of individual, I suspect, does not thrive in a place where you have to be careful what you say. I think that there's just a certain rebelliousness, a certain cheekiness, a certain obnoxiousness that is part of being an innovator, an entrepreneur, because you don't respect the rules. You don't respect the way things have always been done. You certainly don't respect authority. Just that guy who says, no, you guys don't, we can do it differently and better. And so I think they tend to aggregate and flourish in liberal democracies. So a place like China, they've got the numbers, they've got the capital.
Okay, so your argument is true of China, but how about India? Where again, it's
so
healthcare
India, by the way,
dominating. It's healthcare, manufacturing, and diversified industry.
So India is considered
it's the foremost liberal democracy.
It's actually considered an illiberal democracy. So in as much as on paper they're the world's biggest democracy, in reality they've got all kinds of constraints to that are atypical, in terms of freedom of expression and it's not the same as the rest of the West. And I think that's what's held them back. If you look at China and India and their economic growth over the last 50 years, part of the reason why they've trailed China is, and it's actually quite weird because they're the democracy, right? And China is the autocracy, but they have been, they've not embraced free markets as aggressively as the Chinese did between 1981 and today. And that's why they've been lagging, and that's why. So a lot of the world's greatest technologists are actually Indians, but where do they work?
Silicon Valley.
They don't work in India. Why is that? Right. So because they just realized that,
And it's certainly not for lack of capital.
of course, it's not lack of capital. There's lots of capital in India, but they just feel that they are much more likely to thrive in a place like Silicon Valley or London than Mumbai or.
Okay. So coming back to Africa, what excites you around the technology space in Africa? When if you were to look into your crystal ball, not that you have a crystal ball, but if you were.
Well, my whiskey glasses will do as a substitute for a crystal ball.
Yeah, and if you were to look ahead, what are you seeing within the technology space? What should we be keeping our pulse?
So I think, that's a good question. So I'll start with Zimbabwean perspective. I think one of the biggest game changers in our country over the last 2 decades was Econet, or the telecoms revolution. You actually, in 1998, you had less than 30% of the country had access to telecoms. And today you've got more than 100% penetration. You've got mobile money, and you've got, people are using apps and all these other tools that were actually unimaginable 10, 20 years ago. So that was a big deal. And I think the next big revolution, or one of the next big revolutions in Zimbabwe, is going to be distributed solar, because ZESA and its
50% of our population are actually not on the grid.
And its siblings just have absolutely no capacity to solve the power issue. And the beauty about distributed solar is you can do it at any level. So if you live in a rural area, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and all you need is a little bit of power to charge your feature phone, there's a product there for $15-20 that you can buy that will light your hut and charge your small feature phone. If you live in this part of Harare and you're fed up with all the power outages, for maybe 15-20K, you can go off grid. You can install solar panels, an inverter, and battery storage.
And the technology is just going to get cheaper
and it's getting cheaper and cheaper. In fact, one of the interesting things that happened a couple of weeks ago is that the South Africans announced that when Eskom is actually selling electricity, because the rollout of distributed solar in South Africa has been so aggressive, they're actually not selling as much as they would like when they have power to sell. Because a lot of South Africans have installed rooftop solar and battery storage. And it's just...
Okay, so I get it. You're excited about solar.
Solar's going to be a big deal. I think digital banking is digital wallets are going to be a really big thing. In fact, in Zim, they already...
We're going to jump the regulatory hurdles.
So the biggest bank in our country, by the way, is EcoCash. They've got more than 6 million customers. They've got more customers than all the legacy banks put together. And I think that, we can, I don't want to get into the weeds of this, but I think the reason why they haven't really flourished to their full potential is because of regulatory issues.
Well, let's move away from Zim. One could argue that's the case with Safaricom, but the legacy banks in Kenya are still they're still kicking ass. They're doing very, very well.
Yeah, but I think they're dinosaurs. I think brick and mortar banking is, it's on its last legs. Digital wallets are the future of banking. I have big fights with George about this. He thinks there's always going to be space for legacy banks. I think there'll always be space for investment bankers, people with ideas who want to structure innovative transactions. But I think day-to-day banking, The digital wallet is going to dominate. And
Could you put a time to it, a time frame to it?
so certainly, I think, in the next 3 to 5 years, it'll be clear to everybody that that the legacy banks are on the same path as the dinosaurs were 65 million years ago.
Okay. What gives you that confidence? Because if you look at banking, the relationship, when you look at banking, it's really about relationships, right? And it's been true of the last, the Medici, that's 14 something. So it's been true of the last 700
So the
800
Medici
years.
the Medici were merchant bankers, or in today's powers,
relationship. It's always about
So
relationship
merchant
banking.
banking will always be about merchant banking, and investment banking will always be about relationships. Okay, will always be about a guy coming to you and saying, Tinashe, what's your vision for your business?
Everything is on the
Yeah.
back of that.
But-
Because
but-
once you capture the relationship, then retail banking is on the back of.
Yeah, but the retail
banking.
consumer actually wants to spend less time interacting with their banker, right? So if they can have an app on their phone that they get a notification that, based on your salary deposit over the last 6 months, you qualify for a mortgage of this amount. Do you want it? Or you qualify for a car loan of this amount. You qualify for a credit card, right? If they can do everything on their phone without ever interacting with a human being, why would they? And it's cheaper.
I'm just saying that the relationship doesn't start with the retail customer. If you think about it, for a lot of banks, the relationship starts with the corporate, the guy you work for. So you want all these facilities, but it's actually driven by employment history. Who is actually employing you, right? So banks, they know that the relationship is driven by who is employing you. So if you can make that easy, if you have a relationship with a Zimplats, for example, then you capture the entire ecosystem. So whoever works for Zimplats, yes, doesn't need to talk to the bank because now they have all these facilities. But they only have these facilities because the banker has a relationship with Zimplats. And do you see in the future where Zimplats could have could do away with the relationship, with their banking relationship, and it's all on the phone? That the FD for Zimplats could plan their entire cash flows purely on the phone without need for a relationship manager. Do you see that possible?
Yeah, so like I said, for merchant banking, for corporate banking, for investment banking, there's always going to be a need for a relationship. But even in that space, the world is changing. So I'll give you an anecdote. I know we don't like anecdotes here, but I think this is just to help you picture, the dramatic nature of this change. And I remember it blew my mind at the time. It's about 5-6 years ago. The biggest M&A transaction in the world. I think it involved AT&T in the US. But basically, the guy, one of the banks who advised on the transaction, was the former head of M&A at one of these investment banks. He had quit, right? But he had the relationship with, I think, AT&T or the other party. And he didn't even have an office. He was renting a desk at a law firm somewhere in New York, right? And he was one of the principal advisors on the transaction. And the point I'm trying to make is, right, the amount of infrastructure that you need to manage that relationship is shrinking all the time.
Yeah, the back office. So I think the front office will always have its relevance, even if it's one individual.
Exactly.
But I think that the back office, I agree with you that you can do with the back office, and you could outsource the back office, and you could have, all sorts of things with the back office. But as far as the front office,
you always need to have the relationship.
and
absolutely.
that's what. So I don't think that the legacy banks are going away. I think that the face and the color of legacy banks is certainly going to change. But I don't think that they're going away. That's my argument. And I think that big corporates will always need an individual, whether that individual is housed within an institution or outside an institution. I think that most people would trust an institution. So if you look at the big banks, internationally, they keep growing bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
But they're not growing organically. They're growing by acquisition.
Acquisition, yeah, no, which is true. But when you look at back office, they're doing away with the back office. So I agree with you that you don't need middle office anymore. You don't even need to house it within the institution. So if you're an individual, you establish the relationship, and all the middle office and back office, that can easily be outsourced. And in fact, if you outsource it, then the cost actually substantially goes down. But I think that banks will innovate. I don't think they're going away. That's my view.
I think they're not going to disappear completely, but I think the landscape is going to look completely different.
I agree with you.
And the biggest banks in the world, like already, if you look at the biggest market or the biggest markets, right? The biggest banks in China are platforms like WeChat and Alipay. In the US, JP Morgan Chase is still the biggest bank, but right nipping on their heels is PayPal with their cash, with their Venmo app, and I think the other company has got the Cash app. It used to be called Square. It's now called Block. Yeah, the company run by Jack Dorsey, the former Twitter CEO. Yeah. So the two next biggest banks by customer count in the US today
are technology driven.
Are technology companies. Okay. They're digital wallets.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's a very valid argument. Okay. So I think we've covered quite a bit. And I think on our next rabbit hole, we'll sort of cover all the other different sectors. But this
is the producer jumping up and down.
Yeah, he's jumping up and down.
Are we done already?
We're done already.
Yeah, that was good.
But there's a lot for us to cover. And I hope the audience, I hope you found this as riveting as I did. And it's always interesting to pick on someone as wise sometimes. But actually to think around technology and how technology is actually going to affect Africa. I think that the banking sector, we didn't cover AI because I think it's going to affect Africa, but there's a whole lot that's happening. I think the conversation around AI is happening, which is great. But I think that there's a lot of disruption, as we've already highlighted, even in the banking sector. Is coming. There are numerous disruptions that are going to happen. Just remember that technology is beyond just information technology. It cuts right across all the different sectors, even tourism. Just our idea of what tourism is going to fundamentally change, especially with AI.
Yeah.
Right? That maybe somebody doesn't even need to leave their home to enjoy Mana Pools or to enjoy Victoria Falls. Have people actually started thinking about it? Well, let us know if you've actually started thinking about it. But this is a conversation we'll have another time.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, have yourself a great weekend. And cheers. Cheerio.